Whatever my opinions are towards Doom 2, it is not a bad game, yet it might be a bad sequel if you enjoyed how the original balanced speed, combat, and exploration across all skill levels. Nightmare mode is not something I care enough to explore, but it provides an optional challenge for players who want to test both their mastery of combat and the level design. Yet this mode also manages to balance these three components. This perspective might seem contrary to what many people may think about Doom 2, as it is, in one sense, more of the same, while providing enough tweaks to make it a worthy successor. Like the dilemmas between Alien vs. Aliens, or Terminator vs. Terminator 2, the adjustments to the previous iteration are fundamentally at odds and yet respectfully faithful to what many players enjoyed about Doom. If judged as its own game, Doom 2 is a phenomenal FPS. It's only when judged in context to the original Doom does its shortcomings become ever more apparent. You may have noticed something obviously missing when discussing what makes great level design, and that aspect is if quality level design is complex or simple to a certain degree. We can easily see that Duke Nukem 3D has far better level design than Duke Nukem Forever. However, the differences between Doom and Doom 2's level design is harder to immediately identify. There is a reason behind this omission, because the answer is it is dependent on the game, and preferences are perhaps more applicable than anything concrete to make a definitive assessment. Doom vs. Doom 2 brings this topic to the forefront with their varying approaches. One may argue that Doom's complex levels and exploration are what make it timeless, whereas Doom 2's simpler arenas and its action-focused design are what make it more memorable. In addition to this distinction, there is a larger emphasis on Doom 2 to ignore any cohesive map layouts that have defined purpose and place. Although every stage is connected by teleporter exits, removing any semblance of a larger world design despite the map screens in between levels, Doom had an impressive adherence to loop levels back in on themselves, as well as create believable environments despite its minimalistic aesthetic. Doom 2 largely ignores any sense of realism, which would be fine if it led to a better gameplay experience. It does, however, affect how players navigate these levels if they lack clarity from the lack of overall cohesion. In the interest of saving you and I the time to go through all 64 stages, this detailed comparison will not examine every stage. The general idea should be clear from these few examples. For added communication, green lines are drawn for the intended pathways to reach the exit. It should also be noted that one reason Doom 2 takes a lot longer to become more complex is due to making the campaign for 30 levels rather than the original's episodic structure. When examining the first stages, hangar and entryway largely follow the general U-shaped path towards the exit, but one major difference that can be felt while playing is how much more excess space is created for entryway. This whole area from the starting point and the secret area for the shotgun are their own islands. In contrast, the hangar's secret area offers not only a shortcut to reach the exit, but also another vantage point for combat in the connecting room. Even the acid pit in the center provides more than added visuals, as it teaches the player about acid damage by placing superior armor there to tempt new players. In either case, both maps are solid introductions, as they provide the same ideas of goals, of basic gameplay introductions, and of rewarding players who explore with optional rooms and secrets, which Doom 2 is arguably better, as you can pick up a rocket launcher. Immediately after this level is when the smaller changes become more noticeable. Nuclear Base, compared to Underhalls, has remarkable differences that is probably best explained by the episodic framework versus one series of levels. These stages are focused on teaching players about keycards, which the original provides only one key here, whereas Doom 2 has two of them to get the same point across. What is more visually apparent is these levels expand on their previous concepts for level design. Nuclear Base takes the previous U-shaped level now with two U-turns, more stretched out and with more optional areas to explore with their own added rewards like the chainsaw or the chain gun. Verticality becomes a more prominent feature, and even one area is a miniature maze to utilize the lighting features to cast the illusion of shadows. Underhalls teaches backtracking with one U-turn, and it's primarily a level to show off the super shotgun, an upgrade for the regular shotgun to be more useful against tougher enemies and against denser clusters that become more common to Doom 2. Following this stage, Doom 2's next two levels repeat a similar setup with some teleporters, triangles, to obscure how it repeats the same ideas, whereas Doom's next area continues with expanding on its previous environment and with optional challenges and rewards. The last two stages I want to go into extensive detail are from Doom 2, Dead Simple and Tricks and Traps, and it's here where the combat focus takes a more prominent role. Dead Simple is, as the name suggests, where you are fighting several hordes of enemies. The first wave is several mancubi in the smaller square region before engaging a dozen arachnotrons from the outside as you weave in and out of the inner and outer squares. As you can see from the footage, it highly encourages speed or careful positioning around the corners to avoid taking damage, and what may be a simplistic level remains a great challenge of skill. Tricks and Traps is perhaps the clearest distinction of how different Doom 2's level design can be, as it all starts from the center region with doors that lead to their own section-off challenges that appear even more unrealistic from the overhead map. Again, this level is fun for how unique it is, and as we'll see when we revisit a similar level in Doom 64, this map idea can still make logical sense and encourage better map design. From these two stages, it became ever clearer that if you had tried to play Doom 2 like how you played the first game, you would be unable to handle its changes without many failures. Now, as much as I have criticized the sequel, Doom isn't perfect with its own levels, as it also can become excessive with its complexities that border on the extreme. Mount Erebus from Episode 3 is a prime example where it admittedly is visually and mechanically stimulating from its lava pits and real islands that make this summit an engaging level. As this level is towards the end of the base game, the challenge of navigation and combat reaches a point where most players would be well accustomed to find the game a reasonable task. The problem is the exit is hidden behind a red door hidden off the edge of the main island. You would have to know where this spot is, as is not foreshadowed, much like the Halls of the Damned, which is an entirely non-linear environment where you open a series of doors that are easily communicated from the start. Mount Erebus was one of the rare times I had to resort to a guide, and it's perhaps a counter-argument as to why Doom 2 chose to focus more on its combat improvements. Even later levels, like the Courtyard, resemble something with the same level design complexity and overall cohesion as the original Doom, and the master levels of Doom 2 are even more complicated. Unfortunately, the combat changes are what steer the sequel off as its own entity that takes what was a reasonably tough series for its time towards a game bordering on unfairness. Aside from the super shotgun, which is the only new player mechanic added to the game, Doom 2 adds in several enemy types that upset the balance from the original. As Mark Brown notes in What Can We Learn from Doom, there is a clear separation of attacks that scale up from weak hit-scan enemies, shotgunners and zombie men, and melee threats, pinkies and lost souls, as well as weaker yet fast projectile threats, imps, to more tougher demons with slower projectiles, cacodemons and barons of hell. Boss-like enemies such as cyberdemons and arachnotrons were outliers, but their limited usage made them not as jarring to fight outside of their first encounter. Doom 2, however, adds in several enemy types that upset this previous difficulty curve, as gunners are hit-scan enemies with massive health, pain elementals summon an endless amount of lost souls, and archviles have a 3-second wind-up hit-scan attack that results in massive damage. Whereas Doom encourages players to play more carefully, it's almost a requirement to keep moving and or weaving in and out of cover during attack animations. Momentum did play a role in the prior entry, as indicated by the Nightmare mode, but it was relegated for experts, not the general audience. Although the consensus on Doom is it's about projectile attacks that can always be avoided, Doom 2 breaks this rule with how punishing it can be while adhering to the same control schemes, health and armor mechanics, and gunplay from the original. It's for this very reason that if we compare the sequel to the original, it is arguably a failure as it does not adhere to the same gameplay identity within the same limitations. In between the purgatory of Doom 2 to Doom 3, the legacy of Doom has remained as vibrant as ever despite 10 years until the next official installment. Many source ports and mods were released that kept the name alive, and, over its lifetime, Doom has had 27 unofficial source ports that are now commonplace, such as GZ Doom, Xandroom, and Doomsday Engine. Modding continues to this day because the game's code and tools are easily accessible for anyone. However, for this section, I want to discuss the impact those 10 years have had by examining the official modder-created expansions and the impact those mods have played in that long intermission. Between the Plutonia and the TNT expansions, Final Doom is definitely a fan-made work rather than an official product, although it was officially licensed by id. These expansions are largely focused on the design philosophies of Doom 2 rather than Doom, as it prioritizes difficulty, yet these expansions have some of the most complex level design of the whole series. TNT greatly suffers for this reason, as some levels incorporate tedious yet creative ideas, like navigating the pillars over a bottomless pit that can only be seen on the automap. And some levels are so complex and demanding that it borders on the absurd, like Mount Pain. This map is perhaps the most notorious level from TNT Doom, as it spawns over 40 lost souls that will charge seemingly at the worst times from a distance. Plutonia, however, has maps of similar quality to Doom and Doom 2, yet the expansion's fundamental problem is that it is more of the same with another 32 levels. Without any major gameplay changes, most people, including myself, find it difficult to continue these expansions as the runtime of Doom and Doom 2 are enough. However, these expansions weren't made for people like me, as they were made to sate audiences who craved more, and that hunger has lasted to this day with the modding scene. Now, it would be impossible to talk about every single notable Doom mod out there, as the list becomes ever exceedingly larger than Steam's growing catalog, so I will leave that pursuit for channels dedicated to that impossible goal. My intentions are to talk about how those 10 years have affected the perspective of the average Doom player, and it's perhaps a reason why modding can become potentially harmful to a franchise. For the sake of clarity, I want to state up front that I love mods, and modding can tailor games for individual interests as well as lead young creators towards future opportunities in game development. One example is the Plutonia expansion, which gave the two brothers involved an entryway into Valve back when they actually made games. The type of mods that I am going to criticize do not include movie or game adaptations, such as Ghostbusters or Z-Blood, spoof mods meant in good or bad taste like the Pole mod, or experimental ones like No Man's Sky and Doom. None of these mods can be confused with the base games, so there's no reason to condemn unique creations as they cannot be mistaken by the average player. Instead, the mods that are under my discussion include overhaul projects and user-created maps, which the latter of the two is far less damaging. As much as reviewers and people like myself critique these classics, these games are in reality very simple compared to modern games. Its simplicity is both its charm as well as a creative restriction that makes the gameplay so timeless despite its archaic elements like the inability to jump. For these reasons, and perhaps many others you can conjure up, Doom is the most perfect proverbial canvas for young adolescents and adults to cast their emotional angst and creativity towards, where their own blood as much as their enemies is what they paint with. Catharsis, whether personal or shared with others, is the drive for what many modders want out of their creations. But it's important to realize the strokes they use are from their own vision of the game. Whatever user-created content you play further changes how you examine not only the community's contributions, but also the official content. And if left completely unchecked, as in the case of Doom, the series translation, as far as what are the original designer's intentions, becomes forever torn apart. Even when John Romero returned to create a new version of E1M4 and E1M8 in 2016, perhaps an honest interest more than a marketing ploy for his new game, his perspective is altered after 2 decades of FPS design, as well as 2 decades of user-made content for Doom. Can anyone even argue that the original, while mechanically the same on every computer, has remained the same game in all this time from these ever-minute incremental changes across the evolution of Doom? Whereas we can rightly complain about EA making almost unidentifiable changes to yearly released games instead of taking their time, can we also blame too much change without limitations that modding can create over a vast amount of time? This statement isn't attempting to equate the severity of each situation. As I've said before, I love mods and I support modders to expand games. But is there a point where modding becomes a problem for future games as the developers lose focus of what people want? As we'll see in future installments, this problem will become a focal point as to why fans are disappointed or positively receptive to these games. These questions aren't something I can offer definitive answers because modding often constitutes a small percentage of players. Although for Doom, that number might actually be higher given how prolific its modding scene is compared to any other game. Tangible evidence may not yet exist in any foreseeable future, but the reality of that situation is one that warrants consideration as we examine how Doom has changed in its isolation.